Hello. So, yeah. So, on behalf of JNU Academy, I, Nitish Kumar, welcome you all for today's book discussion on the political life of memory. Hello. Is it coming? So, on behalf of JNU Academic, I, Nitish Kumar, welcome you all for today's book discussion on the political life of memory, Birsa Munda in Contemporary India by Dr. Rahul Ranjan. Before formally beginning the discussion, let me briefly introduce the forum, the theme, and the panelists of today's talk. JNU Academic is an entirely student-driven open forum. The foundational principle of the forum is to enrich and enliven possibilities of democratic and social civil discourse inside the campus on issues that are of social relevance. Very recently, we held a very successful two-day conference on the theme titled "The Future of Indian Political Theory," with generous financial help from the Foundation for Creative Social Research. Today's book discussion is centered around Dr. Rahul Ranjan's latest book, The Political Life of Memory, Birsa Munda in Contemporary India by Cambridge University Press 2023. Like all other sessions, this session is also entirely financed by the students, so we request our audience to kindly donate using the QR code that is kept at the T so we can continue to organize enticing sessions and such as this. There's also a book, so please write your name and scan the QR code. It has been over 20 years of making Jharkhand a separate state in the name of Adivasi identity. Despite enormous hope, the question of Jal, Jangal, and Jameen is still not settled. And the resistance movements are going on in the Adivasi areas all over Jharkhand. The book in the discussion today, Political Life of Memory, Birsa Munda in Contemporary India, examines the representation of Dharti Aaba, Birsa Munda in the contemporary politics of Jharkhand. This book moves beyond the question of can the subaltern speak. This book moves beyond the question of can the subaltern speak and argues that we fail to hear them because we lack structures of hearing. It is not the absence of their speech. In this way, the author uses the framework of memory politics to investigate the events, resistance, and movements which invoke the historical past and legacies of Birsa and Ulgulan to shape the everyday politics of the state. Dr. Ranjan adopts the ethnographic method to situate the practice of statue making, samadhi sthal, memorial pillars, and stone slabs in Pathalgadi village in the wider political and cultural milieu of the politics of Jharkhand. With this, now let me briefly introduce the speaker and discussant of today's book talk one by one. Dr. Rahul Ranjan is an interdisciplinary environmental scholar appointed as the Postdoctoral Research Fellow at the Oslo Metropolitan University, Oslo in Norway. He is working on the project Riverine Rights, the currents and consequences of legal innovations on the rights of rivers. He completed his PhD at ICWS, School of Advanced Study, University of London. He was a recipient of Louis Arbour Studentship and Yusuf Ali's bursary. Before that, he submitted his MPhil at the Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. At the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, Rahul's work presents an interdisciplinary approach to illustrate the role of symbolism, memory, and oral history in understanding contemporary Adivasi politics. It investigates the making of the Adivasi icon Birsa Munda in contemporary Jharkhand using the framework of subaltern and memory studies. He recently edited a volume at the Crossroads of Rights, published by Routledge Press, London. The book in the discussion, that is The Political Life of Memory, Birsa Munda in Contemporary India, is Rahul's long-term research and doctoral work published by the Cambridge University Press in 2023. The discussant of today's book discussion is Dr. Sangeeta Dasgupta. She is an associate professor at the Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Her research interests are Adivasi studies, environmental history, colonial ethnography, missionary studies, and visual representation. She is the author of the two illuminating books titled Reordering Adivasi World, Representation, Resistance, Memory, published in 2021, and The Politics of Belonging in India, Becoming Adivasi with D.J. Rycroft, published in 2011. She has received numerous grants, fellowships, and honors, including UK Visiting Fellowship, Nehru Trust for the Indian Collection at the Victoria and Albert Museum for 2020-21. She was the principal investigator for the project titled Life history and speeches of Jaipal Singh Munda in constitutional committees and the parliament, funded by Dr. Ram Dayal Munda Tribal Research Welfare Institute, Ranchi. After completing her MPhil and PhD from JNU, she joined CHS as an assistant professor in 2008. Before joining JNU, she was a senior lecturer at Visvarti University, Santiniketan. I welcome you to this discussion. Before inviting our panelists today, I will outline the format of today's discussion. So Dr. Rahul Ranjan will speak first for around 30 to 35 minutes. The discussion, Dr. Sangeeta Dasgupta will comment on the book for 15 to 20 minutes, after which Dr. Rahul will respond. In the second round, there are two student discussions, Chotelal and Himanshu, who would speak for 5 minutes each, followed by a response from the author. Then we will open it for the audience and take it further. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Rahul Ranjan to make his presentation.
Um, Thanks everyone for coming over, and thanks to Priya who started the discussion that led to this invitation. As you know, I did my MPhil not long ago here at the CPS, so it's both matter of privilege and slightly intimidating. So I'm very excited and nervous at the same time. What I will try and do in my presentation is give you an overview of the book in a way that would allow you to engage in the discussion that would be hereafter. So, The Political Life of Memory is a book which was very much conceptualized at CPS when I was an MPhil student. During my MPhil, I worked on Land Acquisition Act, and I tried to look at a social movement in very urban area of Ranchi called Nagari. And during the fieldwork, I accumulated a lot of frustration about how when we write about conflict-ridden land acquisition, we often use narrative as an appendix. So narrative of people who have suffered become footnote to the description, which remain very well within the logic of policy. So I decided to take up, and during the MPhil, I spoke with a number of Adivasi women specifically who used Birsa as more than metaphor. So I partly grew up in Ranchi and partly, mostly in Darbhanga. So I had personal interest in knowing the landscape in which I grew up. So this project then looks at three things, but just to set a background, assuming that not everyone knows about Birsa Munda. Birsa Munda was born at the end of 19th century. He lived a very short life of about 25 years. And within that span, he has had several facets that he took up in order to stage the rebellion, which came to known as Birsa Ulgulan. And in that period of 25 years, he went from taking up a facet of a saint where he was influenced by the teaching of Vaishnavism and developing a oeuvre of sort of religious and cultural ethics, which is today, at least within the small section of community within Adivasi known as Birsaism. So Birsaites are the one who followed Birsaism. And then he transitioned into more political space where he took up some of the key questions of what was already ongoing called Sardari movement, which is the agrarian movement. So in this book, I divide book into three equal. The first section of the book situates the discussion. So there's been a lot written on Birsa Munda in different ways, and I try and consolidate all of the literature there is. So in that sense, my book does not fill the gap. It just advances the knowledge that exists. So there's a huge discussion on Birsa movement as being millenarian and messianic. And one of the first magisterial work was done by Kumar Suresh Singh, which was initially called Dust Storm, and later, as part of his PhD at University of London, became Birsa movement. And now that text in itself is a huge text because it's well cited. It has huge amount of archival resource. Even as an anthropologist, it explores several facets of Birsa's life and present, I would say, most comprehensive idea about the movement. And then there are commentaries that came in form of responses. So, and some of the things that came in immediate form were, actually in literature. So Mahashweta Devi's work Aranyadhikar, which went on to win the Sahitya Akademi Award, was one of the key places where you can find the influences or dialogue between both. Um, and later on, number of contemporary work has come in response to. Uday Chandra has written a commentary, a very extensive piece on Birsa movement, looking at archive and making an argument that it was neither proto nationalist or anti-colonial, and therefore we need to disentangle these two broader framework that we use in order to analyze the movement. And then you have work of Alpa Shah, who has done long-standing work in Jharkhand. She's an anthropologist, and her work in the shadow of the state is one of the key work that looks at Jharkhand as a site. But she looks at how, unless we do not move away from the framework where we separate religion and politics and design this framework what she calls as sacral polity, we would not fully realize the potential of Adivasi politics. So these are set of, and there are many more literature that's written in the text, but I'm just skimming through some of the broader debates. So this book, in one sense, make a departure from this uh, body of literature by showing what makes Birsa relevant today, and how do memory become a structuring tool among Adivasi to stake claims in social movement. Why is it that Birsa remains relevant, and not just relevant as a historical figure, but is often personalized in accounts of different social movement in different ways. So I try and show different facets of Birsa Munda and representation of his life in different movements. And in that sense, there are some work which actually is um, key to developing this framework. So Daniel Roycroft has done um, fantastic work on looking at the role of photograph in gaining national visibility. So I try and consolidate all these work to look at how memory is used as a key tool of political mobilization in Jharkhand. So then there are two other parts to the book. First part is historical memory, and the second part is ethnographic memory. So historical memory situates basically Birsa Munda in the background of a larger debate of missionary arrival in the area in Chota Nagpur, and as well as agrarian distress. So combination of both these different kind of agents in history making and their role in contribution of making of the Birsa Munda. I wouldn't speak much on missionary because Professor Dasgupta has written extensive work on missionaries in the region, where she shows how each different missionary group came to the region with their specific goals. So often, in times like today, we lump missionary together as a homogeneous entity. But if you look back in some of the archive, you will find out that they're internally differentiated in terms of their goals and also in terms of their theological ambition. So not each missionary group just came simply to convert the soul of what they called then heathen, but there's actually larger politics at play, and it actually goes on to show um, through some of the judicial file. And in doing so, I look at three different archives. So one is judicial file, which is about agrarian distress and litigation, which is commissioned at British Library in London. And then I look at Central Mission Society Reserve, which is a consolidated archive of different missionary groups, which is commissioned at University of Birmingham. And I try and show how each missionary group contributed to the making of movement, but also how one group specifically, called Lutheran, who came from Germany, actually went on to advance and extended huge amount of support to Adivasi in order to litigate. So this is an area where law has never been part of property transactions. So often property were transferred from one to another generation through oral transmission of knowledge and through different other kinds of artifacts that I show in the book. So that's history of the movement, which is rather complicated and very diverse than simply an anti-colonial. Anti-colonial was one of the many facets of the movement. So of course, Birsa fought against British, but he fought as much against Zamindars and upper caste, who were equally invested in structurally marginalizing Adivasis at the end of 19th. So I rescue that debate and uh, lay out different stakeholder impacts. And then I moved to ethnographic memory. So I did my PhD in anthropology, and one of the key tool in anthropology is to use ethnography as a method. So I wanted to know if we can use memory as a form of method to investigate tensions that remains unresolved in history. So just to give a brief idea, history is a systematic study of past, often in an objective pursuit which progresses linearly, and we can have broader discussion on this. Whereas memory is the representation of past. It's personalized account of individual and community at the level of both individual and community. So it's personalized accounts of knowledge that may be transmitted but also often experienced. So I use memory then how people remember. So the key question of the book was how do people remember about the past? And in this case, how do they remember about Birsa Munda? So there are three chapters in ethnographic memory. I was always interested in how, when we look at politics, we look at muscular form of political mobilization, where we think only human beings through their extensive mobility in terms of ground movement can assert certain kind of political power. I was interested in how objects can be used as an extension of political power and ideology. So I got interested in looking at statues and memorials. I have a chapter that look at why certain statues are built in and across Jharkhand and what purpose does it serve. And in doing so, I contrast different narratives of what we call as built environment. So why a certain statue was built, for instance, in Ulihatu, what went in the process of making it, which was one of my field sites, and what relevance does it hold to political parties as opposed to those Adivasis who live in the area with little to no benefit that it might bring to the area. So I try and show these contrasts, and through that process how these these material objects become material memories, what a concept that I developed in the chapter as an extension of ideological basis. And then I move to the last chapter, which is an incidental chapter to the project. While I was doing my fieldwork, Pathalgadi movement had begun to sprung across Jharkhand. It always remained, but it just so happened that while I was based in Koti, it had peaked to a point of deep confrontation between Pathalgadis who were involved, Adivasis as well, against the state. So while this chapter was incidental, and I hope some of you are finishing PhD, I was trying to finish my PhD too, um, and I was forced to not think about it, but I thought this is a great reserve of uh, knowledge in a way that some of the questions that I was asking, let's say in the historical memory, where I look at, for instance, record of T.S. Macpherson, who did extensive land survey in Porhar district, have these really extensive discussion on how Adivasis were using burial stones as markers of territory. So I thought, in some sense, the discussion or there's this overwhelming presence of historical past in different way in a movement that's very content. So I go back to archive with some of the fieldwork that I did, and I try and show how um, Adivasi very much use this idea of Pathalgari as a way to mark their territory. So reasserting right of self-governance, reasserting right of what I call as shared sovereignty, where Gram Sabha must be respected, um, and show the limits to which we can use modern methods, so-called modern methods, to draw these boundaries of belonging. And in that chapter, I interview number of Birsites who still follow Birsaism and try to show how often even within communities such as Birsites, there is a constant idea of self-identification, which may and may not lead to this idea of Adivasi as one group, right, at the level of state politics. Um, and and it is in this chapter that I bring together this discussion about how, while history is important, it is the personalization of history in communities' memory that constitute every day of politics, and that is including stake making, claim making, staking claims in policies, in marking boundaries, in developing new methods of resistance. Uh, and largely the book shows how, for the longest time, Adivasis are portrayed in the popular literature, especially if you look at early writings of Guire in 70s and etc. as the as a group that's at the outside of or the fringes of civilization, often portrayed in popular movies and etc. as backward, as object of the past. I try and argue in the book it's actually no more simply about portrayal of a specific kind. It's actually a precondition for Indian modernity. So it is now impossible for Indian states to be developed if they do not constantly make Adivasi as the racialized other. It actually provides conditions for growing as a state because you have someone in contrast to what nation grows against, right? And I bring all of these discussion together within the ambit of memory. I would have loved to read a section, but I'm happy to actually take up more questions and answers than just simply reading. But yeah, thanks for having me.
I would like to mention.
Okay, so I'll actually begin with a tweet from our Prime Minister, which was on the 16th of February, by when I had already been contacted by the JNU collective, academic, JNU academic to look at the book. This is on February 16th, 2023, paid homage to Bhagwan Birsa Munda at the Adi Mahotsav. What then is this Adi Mahotsav? What kind of statue, what kind of plaque goes with it? Below, of course, the statue was a plaque where it was written Bhagwan Birsa Munda, 1875 to 1900. So what was this all about? I was wondering. There was Birsa Munda statue with the characteristic turban, characteristic bow and arrow, but looking somewhat saintly, not the figure of the eternal rebel that we think of, but much more, as is written, Bhagwan Birsa Munda. Adi Mahotsav celebrated the spirit of tribal culture, and I quote from the release into your PRI. Adivasi Mahotsav celebrated the spirit of tribal culture, crafts, cuisine, commerce, and traditional art. Is an initiative of the Tribal Cooperative Marketing Development Federation Limited under the Ministry of Tribal Affairs. And the statement from our Prime Minister was as follows: Sabke Saath Sabka Vikas. Government goes from Delhi to meet that which was considered far away. That which considered itself far away is now being brought to the mainstream. Very, very characteristic of the kind of developmentalist narrative, and particularly what's happening around us today. And as I looked at it and I saw the tweet, I thought, thank you very much for inviting me. This JNU academic is really a wonderful place where one can sound ideas. For us academics teaching, it's wonderful always to interact with students, hear questions, discuss books which are actually so relevant, the political life of memory. So thanks a lot. I'm very happy to be here, also because I know Rahul is a student. He had come to CHS when he was doing his PhD, his MPhil. Subsequently, when he was doing his PhD, I also met him. So to see finally the end of a project, Rahul, is good fun. So thank you. So how do I look at this book? It's an excellent book, richly textured, nuanced, takes forward many of what one is talking about today. Birsa Munda as an iconic figure. There is also a shared interest that Rahul and I have. We are both engaged with Adivasi studies. We are both trying to etch the contours of what is the newly emerging field of Adivasi studies. We are both trying to bring forward our own writings to enrich the field. And Rahul, in fact, begins by talking about how his is yet another edition. And what I really liked about the book is that it brings together local literature from Jharkhand in the historiographical survey, with also other kinds of books which are there for us to read. In other words, and here I talk about a shared agenda to situate the book and to situate Rahul's intervention. We both try to look at the importance of bringing in Adivasi voices, Adivasi experiences, the local, all of it which comes to light when we particularly understand marginalization, displacement, destruction of ecosystems. Rahul's book is a part of this attempt to decolonize Adivasi studies. And that is for me where it is an engagement with the locality, with the place, with culture. It is bringing in the ethic of engagement. It is engaging with what today we talk about a reflexive understanding of the methods of anthropology, where we talk about reflexivity, we talk about positionality, and Rahul sees himself here as both, very interestingly, a Saki and a Southern. So I really like the way that he positions himself, and I'll read out just a sentence when he talks about how you need to understand the importance of solidarity. And what does he mean by solidarity? Again, very nicely written. It's a meaningful, so this importance of solidarity is a meaningful admission to recognize privilege and how it enables us to do this work. Solidarity sought by the people, with the people, solidarity that heightens the violence and oppression of some. And I'll read this one sentence which actually shows what he is talking about and which I thought was significant, if I can find it right now. Yeah, where he says, above all, I write from a place of solidarity as a way to teach myself to attend to voices, to listen and to learn. I repeat, in no sense does this book represent Adivasis. This book is a form of writing in solidarity. Writing from a place of solidarity has widened the scope of representation to imagine moving towards collective realization. With this, let me then talk about, while Rahul talks about solidarity, I would really like to know, and I push him to tell all of us, a bit about your conversations. In other words, you talked about how with a notebook and a camera, it already is forbidding you from an interaction which is going to be accepted wholeheartedly. So rather than just talk about conversations, what are the silences? What are the difficulties that you face? How does a lack of complete trust actually fashion the narrative? Both yours as well as from the Adivasis with whom you're conversing. In other words, what are the silences? What are the erasures? How do we, as be it historians or anthropologists, actually engage? How do we find or comprehend the difference between academic history writing and community perception? What I'm trying to talk about, therefore, is not just a gap, which of course is there, but actually the limitations of the craft of writing the narrative in itself. So that's the problematic that I'm also trying to raise. And I would say that this is a part of actually these interviews that you have undertaken. Can you tell us a bit about it? Who are also these friends? Anonymity, yes. But can you locate these friends for us? What makes you acceptable as a Safi? What makes, and here I refer to, say, for example, the work of those like Oslo in the African history context, who talk about the importance of actually the person with whom you go to the field, whose narrative are you actually capturing? So these are problematics that come to my mind when I was reading many of the interviews that you have conducted. So that essentially is the first kind of a set of questions that come to my mind as I read or as I read your book. The second is to move to a second group of questions. The first is this. I really liked the very beautifully expressed, the expression, a very beautifully expressed point where you talk about a story of Birsa Munda, which you see as a complex process of transition, and I quote you here, a transition from the colonial to the post-colonial, a colonial which is seen through encounters with the colonial state, literally zamindar, and encounters in the post-colonial. And here you've talked about land dispossession, diluting precautionary legislations like the CNTA, normalizing development as the critical vocabulary in Adivasi regions, situating Birsa Munda amidst all of this. And here then comes the question which I would like to pose. None of these are homogeneous stuff, either the colonial or the post-colonial. Therefore, in response to all of these things that are happening, does the idea of representation, of memorialization, does that shift? In other words, in a much larger ambit of events, which are changing events, which are not static in any way, how do these kinds of issues that you raise begin to change? It is also important to understand that when we talk about representation in the colonial period, we have very different ways through which representation takes place. Not only is it a shift chronologically, as much it is a different way of seeing Birsa. If we look at ethnographic text, if we look at Sarat Chandra Roy, you having quoted Sarat Chandra Roy, if we look, say, for example, at an official who is facing rebellion and thinking of what to do. Therefore, we have very different kinds of representations. We also have very different changing situations in Jharkhand, all of which would be a part of your narrative. So, could you also comment on this kind of theme which I would like to raise? And the reason, for example, why I talk about it is the way Birsa Munda is remembered, even in the post-colonial period, shifts. Say, for example, when you have the Religious Freedom Bill in 2017, Birsa Munda appears along with Kartik Orao. The politics of Kartik Orao and Birsa Munda are completely different. There is a reason why these two appear together. When I began with our Prime Minister's tweet, it's a very different difference. Birsa Munda as Bhagwan Birsa Munda as the iconic rebel figure of Birsa Munda, always with his bow and arrow. These are very different representations. And while you certainly refer to some of this, much of this does not feature in the text. So that's the second kind of question that I have for you. So I want to actually push you beyond just the narrow kind of representation that you deal with, and push the representation of Birsa Munda, not just in Jharkhand, but beyond. So you have certainly referred, I've read the book more or less carefully. So you've certainly referred to, say, for example, you referred to one of the places, I think it was Orissa, where you're talking about Birsa Munda there. But what about the other states? How is this working out is the question. And if by any chance we are going to be thinking of this, what about pamphlets, petitions, which are circulated by Birsa when they're appealing to this thing? And to the Sarkar, the idea of Sarkar again being very different. So in that sense, what kind of representation of history do you get? How does Birsa Munda appear in all of this? You refer to one, but I'm thinking of differences again which will be happening in the post-colonial period, which takes into cognizance all of these changes. Okay. And this brings me to yet another point, which has puzzled me for very long. Why is Birsa Munda such an icon of Adivasi faith? Why not Jabal Singh? Why does Birsa Munda appear, and you pointed that out, in the parliament? Okay, the image of Birsa Munda in the parliament, not of Jabal Singh, who was so prominent in the constituent assembly debates. And this then triggers, and you read, as you said, that a stamp in 1988, the photograph in 1989. Why 88? Why 89? What makes Birsa Munda so acceptable and natural? And this move makes me move to an extension of this question. Is it because Birsa Munda had a KSC? Because when you talk about Bhato, you say that everything is written in the text. That's what he says. And case says for 50%. Or is it because Sarat Chandra Roy picked up Birsa Munda in 1912? In 1912, that's when the Mundas in their country was written. The entanglement between, or the entanglement of the Adivasi and the non-Adivasi, the entanglement of the understanding of in the understanding of heritage and representation, Adivasi voices and non-Adivasi voices. How does this then? Yeah. Okay. And I'll tell you why I am talking about this. You have actually, in the course of your writing, wrote some of these points, but in your introduction, where you're trying to outline your positioning, there it seems to be a clear distinction between Adivasi and between the Adivasi and the non-Adivasi. How Adivasi memories actually begin to question state constructed memories or non-Adivasi persons. So that's why I was saying that perhaps some of the engagement would open up these issues, which you in your theoretical chapter seem to be neglecting. Okay, I move to another set of questions from this one. You've talked about different statues. You've taken up 4 statues in this book. 4 statues are picked up, and he very clearly says why these statues have been picked up. Historical significance of their location and associated political performance have led to this selection. This is what you talk about. I want to ask that these 4 statues, besides these 4 statues, Birsa Munda appears given in corners of the streets of Ranchi, across Jharkhand, in the airport. Everywhere you have Birsa Munda. Okay, different kinds of statues. Does that then lead to another set of questions? Or would your set of questions be applicable for that? And the reason why I ask this is, and I refer to one of the projects that I'm at present doing, which is digitizing the collection of Dr. Nirmal Mins. And Dr. Nirmal Mins is one of the tallest public intellectuals in Jharkhand who passed away in 2021, theologian, priest, anthropologist, educationist, and political activist. Why do I bring him up? Because in Kuruk, he has a very, very powerful poem, which I have a translation of, which is called Veer Birsa. Brave Birsa, and it's in Kuruk. And I will just talk about how Birsa Munda is seen here, so that you can understand the juxtaposition that I'm trying to make. But on the straight piece of paper, almost disintegrating, is Dr. Mins's reactions when he sees the statue of Birsa Munda for the first time at Birsa Chowk in Ranchi. Immersed in his thoughts, he looks at the statue, and this is a paraphrasing of the poem, of course, with somebody from the family, so this is not my translation. So he looks at it and engages in an imaginary conversation with him. How long had Birsa Munda been there, and who was he looking at? To this, Birsa Munda responds that he did not know what lay ahead and could only see an incessant flow of motor cars. His statue was covered with dust, but there was no one there to clean it. Only on specific days of commemoration, leaders and ministers gathered together and offered their tribute to him in the form of flowers and garlands. Through this allegory, Dr. Min suggests that, like Birsa Munda, the Adivasi people are hardworking, but this contribution is never acknowledged in the history of the nation. So, other kinds of parallel ways of recalling Birsa Munda is what I would like you to reflect on. And the reason why I ask this is while Adivasi, you have talked about differences within the Adivasi communities, this is a fragmented group. So you have differences, access to resources and ritual importance based on lineages and patterns of migration, identification with Christianity, those who are followers of Birsaism, Birsaites, Tana Bhagats, those who are identifying with Sarna. So you've got several religions, several ways of recalling Birsa Munda. You've got those who have access to education and government jobs. You have those who respond to patronage extended by political parties, religious groups, and so on. But in this framework that is followed in this book, it all seems to be Adivasi. Um, Nirmal is a Christian, and yet Birsa Munda is one figure that he actually picks up through another kind of representation. So, what are the different kinds of representation that are possible rather than just focus on four statues and a story which is restricted to that? Implicit in this, I argue, is a simple counterposing of the state and Adivasis. Okay? Which, although there is something that you've talked about it, you tried to nuance it, but ultimately it gets reduced, in my understanding, to that. Yeah. So some of these issues that I wanted to raise is therefore at the level of methodology, at the level of expanding sources, at the level of looking at local material, because you're actually looking at a lot of local material, but what happens in the different constructions, what happens across a period of time, what happens in the very choice of Birsa Munda, and how do we understand different contending? It's not just a variety of traditions, but also traditions which are often conflicting and conflicting. So how do we look at all of that? And finally, the craft of writing Adivasi histories, writing on Adivasi memories, and the gap between communities' understanding and our academic. Lots of questions. How long have I taken? What to do when we academics get a chance, we don't stop. But thank you once again to all of you for the chance.
Yeah, so you can come and respond. Yeah. That's a lot of questions. Great question. And I'll try and address that what I can cover, especially the one that I thought was very overflow. In terms of choice, why I worked on this, I'll begin with another thing. Not in the order, but was because he was referred in the movement that I was studying as a metaphor. So I thought, what is it about the relevance of this and not other, I think, or other leaders from within the Adivasi society who hasn't become as proverbial as, let's say, Birsa Munda. But I was also interested in the way I found contrasting imagination between Adivasis and as against the popular representation within the city landscape. So in that sense, it was a very specific, short-sighted PhD concern. But I was just trying to see what might come out of contrasting these two popular ways of understanding. So looking at the way one specific group personalizes memory as against the state representation. And it's actually during the fieldwork I found that there are several ways I could have done it. One is to look at more than one figure and see if that representation, even within the community, hold tight. If Birsa just one among many other, and I think it would have taken the process of writing in a different way. And I wanted to write a political ethnography on Birsa's use of Birsa's memory. So I stuck to that one specific important. But yeah, it's in that sense it's limited. It's only looking at one form of representation, and in two forms. One is the state way of memorializing his past, and as opposed to those who I spoke with over the period of 2 years. But in terms of methodology, I think it's a question that's most dear to me because uh, in political science, at least for which I had done 3 degree, I was not convinced that we were taught enough to do fieldwork in a way that both ethical in nature, but also render some of our assumed privileges that we have in order to even do the study. So there were several conversations um, over the course of a year that were based on, because trust is such a fraught idea, right? It's not always forthcoming, and you have long spell of you know existing between rejection and acceptance and so on and so forth. Um, Therefore, I relied on accounts and faith of the people who generally I found were part of a specific social movement, right? Because I was previously working with people who were involved in land acquisition act. So partly I drew on the strength of that relationship I formed. For instance, Gunjal Munda, and these are people who've allowed me to write their name into the script, and then several who I can't for the sake of their privacy. But I think it's a choice which was more collaborative in nature. That wherever I found that those contacts could take me in terms of access to the field, I relied largely on that. And in that sense, you see a lot of activists speaking in this book at different points, providing different ideas not only about Birsa but also about the broader state politics. So I think I probably could have done more in terms of um, explaining some of the silence in the act of writing, which was definitely there because one prominent feature of doing fieldwork, especially in Koti, is that the idea of suspect looms really large. So you're never, and that wasn't either an intention, but you're never an insider, right? And if you take that as a contingency to frame your question and do your fieldwork, I think it makes it much easier. So in that sense, there were many moments of silences, especially in cases of violation of land rights and people who were involved actively in this. And this is also a period when the Raghuvar Das government has slammed sedition on a huge population within Koti and whoever was part of the region at that time. So I think I think one of the key takeaway from writing this book was to also realize how we assume that Adivasi is one singular and homogeneous group, while they are internally fragmented, and there are several groups that are oriented towards their own um, struggle for immediate survival, and then for then for resistance against the state. So in that sense, there were almost great number of narratives, both in the text and not, that provide for um, not using frameworks that homogenize Adivasi as reducible to one identity. Right? And I think partly that also comes out in, largely that comes out in your new book as well. So that's methodology. And I also thought for the longest time in terms of method, how does one use one's privilege, not just as a form of apology by saying, well, I'm from an upper caste, I'm male, and I have access to the field, but how do I use that in order to forge solidarity? And the solidarity that is what I say in the book, not patronage, not as forms of who asked for it, asking questions, other way around, in order to see. And I think that's something that's an ongoing process. So I may not have the same level of I don't know access or the same level of shared concern with several of activists that I worked with for now many years, because there's a shifting territory of political affiliation as well within the activist group, which is primarily Adivasi. Um, Then in terms of statue, yes, it's a very important question because we have Birsa Munda in Andaman. These Adivasis who migrated to, and Mini India, the book shows us the transport of memory, transportation of memory from Chota Nagpur to. And then I have surveyed statues also in tea gardens in Assam, and you have a statue. Um, but it's just done for the purpose of keeping the coverage of the book limited in order to get it written. I focused on specific areas in which I had worked previously, so to draw more and more strength from existing sources instead of diversifying. But yeah, I mean, in as book grows and more questions that I get, I think I have a chance to develop this more as I go on about writing this and perhaps making a national commentary of what it means. Um, yeah, I don't do. I've sort of forgotten, but trying to remember.
What was your okay? Doesn't matter. This has
No,
been
but
responsible.
I agree that why is it that is Birsa Munda, and I think one of the starting sort of observation I had is that the reference to Birsa Munda both at the national politics and within the state, in the way he's canonized through statue memorials and etc., um, holds a very different meaning within the community. So a number of conversations I've had with people who live in Koti district, especially in Ulihatu where he was born, would often not look at Birsa Munda as the way Hindu icons are framed, which is this warrior iconic figure, but often, for instance, in one of the conversations, um, this Pahan, who is the head of the village, referred to him as first as a Munda, second as an Adivasi, and third as a Birsa Munda. And this idea that we are one among the equal sort of completely disentangle Birsa from the way state does the representation, where in fact, and I have gone on to show how in my conversation with people who are part of building these statues. So one of the instances look at how Birsa's body is sculpted by these modern sculptors who are based in Noida. They have these modern, often that aesthetic representation is steeped in caste imagination of Rajput warriors. So you have this well-built Birsa Munda statue in golden color, um, um, set up in Ulihatu, which, in terms of what it might mean within the society, does not. So I try to extend argument by looking at what does canonization do to, let's say, figures who are not well understood within the context of historical study, and therefore drawing on and yeah. So yeah, I mean, so these are the contrasting. So book really sort of rely on multiple narratives that contest often each other in order to maybe move towards finding this irreducible form of being Adivasi, right? Like which is internally very diverse. But I think it's in the last chapter on Pathalgadi where I had most clarity about what it might mean to do broadly a memory project. That why is it that Adivasis would choose stone slabs and burials instead of choosing whatever else they might have, and there's a direct relationship between memory and history here because this was also evident at the end of 19th century, and far away from this grotesque representation of Adivasis as backward, you have Adivasis using the most modern documents of Indian constitutions inscribed on those burial stones, with so much of interesting provocation like non-judicial areas. I've used different visuals as they kept, and Pathalgiri emerged fortnightly over different places. The places where I lived, places I walked past had no Pathalgiri, and it emerged. So it tells you that in the way um, the, the 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 construction of Adivasi is backward is almost like a state's precondition to imagine modernity project. Whereas in reality, you have Adivasis negotiating with the modern state in the most modern way. And I think part of it also Uday Chandra in his scholarship has shown that it's that negotiation of the subaltern group by using modern methods. But yeah, that's largely my response. But I look forward to more questions.
So yeah, we have two student discussions. So I love to invite Himanshu to speak. So yeah, 3 to 4 minutes. Keep it short, please.
So thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak on this book. Post 2014, we've been seeing a certain form of monumentality in this country, where a certain form of monuments are being desecrated, demolished, removed from the life of political life, be it of Lenin in Tripura, to everyday demolition and desecration of Ambedkar, to Ravidas and all, and a certain form of construction is also taking place. So we see as large as as high as the sky, Vallabhbhai Patel standing there, to the very furious kind of our emblem, which seems that it has completely abandoned the ahimsa of Buddha and somewhat represents more the contemporary muscular and masculine Hindutva politics. And in this setting, I find this book really important because it tries to analyze how memory is situated around certain monuments, certain statues, and that statue is somewhat of Birsa. So in that way, the politics of memory, which is against the coded history, as Rahul writes, that this book attempts to inquire about this and also tries to imagine how Birsa and his politics and the memory of Birsa's rebellion, resistance against imperial order continues to inspire and continues to bring out newer form of resistance and uh, amongst Adivasis, and at the same time how it is appropriated by this regime. So what I could also say that this scholarship also makes us think more about how post 14 tribal appropriation and accommodation has taken place, because we have seen, like when you were saying, Janjatiya Gaurav Divas has been brought out, and the government has promised that they will bring out hundreds of Adivasi museums, right from Birsa to different tribal folk heroes in UP to Assam. They are continuously portrayed against not only colonialism or as anti-colonial warrior, but also against Mughal Raj. So what we see that they are sufficiently tried to accommodate into the larger Hindutva politics, and in that way, I find that this book is really important as it goes through and tries to understand the narration of memory and politics of Birsa Munda. What I also found this book in this book very important is that it enriches our own for readers, that it engages with multiple theories. So in that way, we have so many scholars to read in in memory politics. Along with it, it has very sincere archives and rich ethnography too. So in that way, I find this book really important. But then I have this question, not question, but I think that this is something which I find important to be, which I would like to listen from you, Rahul, is that when memory creation or the site of memory creation and its development also takes place beyond the boundary or commemorative aspect of any statue, any emblem, or graveyard for sure. Uh, so we have folk, we have literature, we have oral histories. So in that way, I would like to know how the study of memory limits our own scope in understanding or reading the political life of any statue or any political hero in that case. And also, as I come from Palamu, and there Birsa always comes in relation to Siddho Kanho, in relation to Nilambar Pitambar. So there are multiple tribal heroes to within Jharkhand. And then I found this book does not brings them in. So I think that maybe on this you can bring out something and let us know. Thank
I'm Total Alkumar. I'm doing PhD in CPS. And I'd like to thank the JNU Academics for giving me opportunity to give a comment, a small comment at my capacity. I'm sorry, I really don't think is as much great as I've just read. I have read just very little. So the book according to my understanding, the book through the inquiry into the politics of Birsa Munda's memory, it talks about the contemporary politics of Jharkhand. The book uses the politics of memory to show the contestations between the state, the political elite, and the Adivasis, where the state and political elites are using the Birsa's memory to narrowly meet their ends. The state is using him as a freedom fighter and martyr, while political elites are using him as an incarnation of God for meeting their ideological aim. The book deems it as a narrow understanding of Birsa's memory. Here, the book, through the extended meaning of colonization, talks about how the Adivasis are using the Birsa's political memory to fight against the internal colonization. The author seems to favor the Birsa as a day-to-day crusaders against the internal colonization. The book affirms it by asserting that Birsa is the Adivasi first. To consolidate and extend the argument of internal colonization, author gives us an example of sudden removal of Janjeer from the Birsa at late night to avoid any protest from the Adivasis. The state is using Birsa's memory on its narrow meaning by depriving the Adivasis from their voice or their agency. So to further extend the idea of internal colonization, the author further extends the idea of internal colonization by discussing the Pathalgadi movement in its fifth chapter. Here, the internal colonization extends not just to the exploitation or silencing of the agencies, but also to the demand of citizens of any foreign rule and establishment of self-rule and establishments of the Birsa Mundas. Basically, in this comment, I'm trying to just highlight the main theme, the internal colonization, which goes through the whole the book. So here I will end with the two questions, which is based on this comment. So in the first comment in this book, through the idea of internal colonization, you are arguing that Adivasis in particular, and Jharkhand in general, is still facing the subjugation and domination, and you even repeat this argument through the hijacking of Birsa's memory by state and political elites. So my question is, the issue of internal colonizations have always been a primary concern for Adivasis, and this concern drove even the creation of Jharkhand. And since then, a lot of years has been passed. And so, do you see any change in nature of internal colonizations and even the change in Adivasi resistance against such internal colonizations? And second question is, so the case of the Pathalgadi movement, you in the chapter 5, you seem to argue that any form of intervention in self-rule is an attack by the outsider. The community derives its sovereignty from their self-rule within the village. So my question is, how do you see the resolving the problem within the constitutional limitations, and are you arguing that there are limitations in the fifth schedule and we need the similar provisions like sixth schedule, or there is something we can do? For example, Virginia's Kaka argued that the Indian democracy itself, the majoritarian democracy itself, is a problem for resolving the Adivasi systems. So this is my thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
First of all, thanks for reading my book. Great pleasure to be written and then to be there. To your question, Himanshu, I think when I had begun the project, I had thought I would simply use a framework and have the framework first set up, then go to the field, collect the data, and try and fill that data into the framework that I've taken from London to Ranchi, classics, anthropology. And the framework was of the Memoir, which is a great body of work by the French philosopher. Uh, but it's called Sites of Memory. And it talks about how history over the time consolidate into objects of representation, and he was specifically interested in peer knowledge. And once history is consolidated in forms of objects, remove people in terms of their capacity to relate to it. So you see several objects in the museum that may not form you similar semblance of relationality with that object. So I took that framework, and in that course of first bit of field work, I realized that a framework is not useful. Um, and I did more study. And so India has within South Asia, there's a great body of literature on memory study that looks at partition, and there's a huge body of work by Gyanendra Pandey, Urvashi Gotalia. But it could not somehow fit to the inquiries that I was interested in. So I wanted to know not about the event as such, but the act. I wanted to see how people use memory in everyday forms of mobilization. Uh, so to your question, yes, there could be other ways of looking at memory, and in some way, the sites that I look at might reproduce the similar kind of framework, which is concretized in terms of object and objects of representation. But I try and supplement each chapter with diverse forms of what I call as memory, material memory. So, for instance, while I was writing a chapter on memorial, which is built in Ranchi, I was also interested in how, when the idea was conceptualized to make a memorial, who would have been the participant? Were Adivasi at all invited to actually design the memorial in which their past is represented? And by that, I mean Birsa Munda. And I speak with number of people, and in that process, I speak with Anurag ji, who is one of the journalists who's been reporting majorly about violence against Adivasi in that area. But he was involved in this process, which would have led to what Ramdayal Munda, Anurag ji, and a number of other people would have called Bormitan, which is basically a Mundari word for coming together. So making memorial as a place for more participatory dialogue rather than an object that represents Birsa's memory. So I provide evidences to structure that in terms of what it might have led to, but I also sort of look at how memory, when it's not in forms of object, would exist, and therefore I look at this extensive song that Ramdayal Munda has written, which is about Dombari Buru, which is another chapter within the text, and I try and provide that as a way to suggest how it is almost impossible to consolidate this vast memory, which is internally very diverse within the community, but also form a way to consolidate in forms of representation. So what then I do is provide different narratives that often contrast each other in order for the reader to imagine the landscape of memory. So in that way, I was also as much asking these questions to myself as I was writing this book. But I believe, and I'm a firm believer of this, that the words you choose in order to name things and places structure the feeling you develop for that. So in writing this book, I make this constant conscious attempt of choosing word that does not emerge as patronage, whether speaking of memory or object. And one way to do is to constantly provide more supplemented forms of memory that could speak with each other. And in that sense, it may not lead to this what we call memoir, which is the concrete site of memory. So it moves away from that kind of work. And in that process, I relied a lot on Mundari, for instance, Mundari literature. And in that process, I spoke with Gunjan Munda, who's been doing great work with the Mundari linguistics. Yeah, so that's a long sort of rambling to your great question. To your question, great. Yeah, I think the logic of internal colonialism is so important in Jharkhand in the way that from when it must have started, and Birsa has different, he hasn't been present at all times from 19th century until the making of Jharkhand movement. There have been periods where he's come back in the popular memory and then he's vanished. So you have the formation of Chota Nagpur Unnati Sabha, which actually uses the word Adivasi for the first time in order to mobilize, and then you have almost absence of Birsa. So I couldn't find, maybe I'm wrong, he may be present in the discussion, but there was some sort of distance in using, in fact, that dialogue between the missionary Adivasis with Adivasis about why we must not use Birsa, because Birsa's image was very problematic to some of the Christian Adivasis. So there's this also like parallel tension within the state as to how much we can mobilize the figure of Birsa. But there is one agreement across, I think, Adivasi group, which is the logic of which only has advanced. So now you have not only um, problems arising from, let's say, Land Acquisition Act for violation of PETA, but also diverse form of extraction. So one of the key reasons why these statues and monuments are built is also to extend the coverage of area through road connectivity, which means providing for more opportunities to expand capital. And in one of the chapter, I actually trace the idea of making Dombari Buru into a site of memory, which is tied more to the idea of ecological tourism than to the site of memory itself, right? So logic, I mean, reasons why Ramdayal Munda would have thought of Dombari Buru as a place of cultural memory is very different from how state design and imagines these sites, right? And I think that provides a lot for how and who, and that's I think where the book ends, where I propose different two kind of memory manifesto, and one of which I suggest that unless we do not have members from within the community as the participant, as the one who creates the framework for memorialization, we would probably always be at a place of not realizing the potential of memory. And in that sense, um, it is through the lived experiences of Adivasi as the core member within designing these memory sites could we actually imagine any form of emancipatory politics in Jharkhand. And it's further entangled with different kinds of questions in this religion.
Audience. Okay, so now the platform is open for the audience, so if anyone can.
So yeah, Darsi.
Yeah. So, hi, it was great listening to you. So, as you marked in your presentation and rightly so, that the growing state, it kinds of otherizes, it racializes the Adivasi community. But taking one example from the 2017 Momentum Jharkhand Summit, and I come from Ranchi and I remember those 2 days quite vividly. So, it was an attempt to develop an Adivasi state, but at the same time, it had a mascot, which was a flying red and green elephant, which had a Sohrai art on it to show that it was an integration between Adivasi indigeneity and development. So how do you look at this aspect? How do you look at these instances? Do you look at it from the perspective of a benevolent state or any other lens?
It's actually part of the description in the book because, I mean, thanks for asking this question. Me up. In that 2017 was also the point where Jharkhand state had developed what is called land bank, which formed the basis for a lot of Pathalgadi uprisings. So not only that aesthetically unpleasing elephant with feathers flying across, almost giving away all the resource. There was a larger politics at play where 200 investors were called in from all parts of the country, and a central land bank forum was opened. And in the subsequent year, from 2017 to 2020, when I had finished writing, there have been, at least the ones that I document, 46 conflicts. And majority of those conflicts that were used in order to dispute the standard emerged from the fact that there are several parts in Ranchi where department, I mean municipal corporation recognizes land as, uh, as jhari. So there's a word JRI used in the municipal corporation where lands that are deemed as non-agricultural could also be rendered as land that could be taken away, but that primarily belongs to Adivasi homes. Right? So in the absence of having document to produce and state claims and property, the land ban actually became a reason why personal jurisdiction emerged. So in that sense, I think um, it provided reasons for why Adivasi mobilization intensified in and after 2017.
Yeah, boy.
Hi Rahul.
Adivasi topic. I'm doing my PhD at University. Looking forward to reach your book. But I have like three questions like that. Like to begin with the business policy. One of the things I can always include is about the idea. I mean, Professor Dasgupta mentioned about this. So how do you see that? I mean, the idea of positionality is really, really important when people are studying, researching marginalized communities issues, and secondly, also like the work on I've seen like there in the we are looking at forces of more or we are trying to use it to revitalize the social system. Do you see that happening here, or we are going to be tangled in this whole debate and the source of the problem, the problem that we are in? I think the question of positionality is deeply and the most important question for me because it's not only in the process of reviewing literature on Adivasi, the rhetoric about can, and I'm saying this intentionally, the rhetoric of can the subaltern speak has actually gone on to perpetuate myths about they cannot speak. So it may have started as a literary provocation, but it has actually not led to the discussion about how do you actually do fieldwork, for instance, if you were to use that kind of framework, and it's led to a position, place where we actually believe Adivasi cannot speak because, and in my work I show it's not the absence of their speech, it's the lack of structure of our own hearing. So they've always spoken and they're speaking, it's that we're not listening or we don't have capacity to listen. So in terms of my position, it's inescapable that I am Savarna and male, and I have worked in this area for over 6 or 7 years. But I have to find a way in which I can use my privileges to not only as a form of apology that, oh, I am Savarna and male and therefore you have to forgive me, but forge active forms of solidarity, and which is rooted in the ways in which I can make my work more democratic and accountable to the people among whom it was written and alongside whom it's going on. And one way to do is to make your work more participative. It's an inescapable question, and I think, at least in my literature review, I didn't find Indian anthropology or sociology for that matter. With such great work we have, there is no reflection on who you are as a scholar. And I thought maybe this is a point I could think about more seriously, and maybe people will take up on. And in that sense, I think um, I don't look at solidarity as a form of fake news. I don't think Adivasis have asked me to come and work on them. And one way to do is to make your work participatory. So, for instance, when I was thinking of transforming my thesis into a book, I was thinking of everyone I had conversations with, including the cover of the book. It's designed by an Adivasi artist who I had known from 2018 when I had met him. And I had thought that what it might look like for an Adivasi artist to think of Birsa in context of memory politics. So we commissioned him, and I worked with a great number of Adivasi anthropologists in National University, and we went through a process of him designing the cover for it to become part of the book. But this is not an excuse to say that now I can legitimize my work, but just thinking about how I can use my privilege in order to produce some of the evidence-informed work that could be effectively used as a toolkit in social movement. So, for instance, if appropriation of Birsa is at rise, and it's been pulled from all direction, how can I write a book in a way that might provide some evidence, some language for Adivasi, non-Adivasi, civil society members who lived in the area to use this as a language to stay sane. So that's one way to look at how you can use your positionality in order to produce an account. Um, your second question, I don't think now I work in the context of New Zealand for the past 3 years, and largely with Maori group. I've done more than half a year of work, and I think these are such different contexts, right? So Canada, I don't know much, so I can't speak. But for instance, New Zealand is a settler colonial context, right? So negotiations between indigenous, non-indigenous is based on negotiation with the crown. So states, in terms of rights and etc., are very different. But there's definitely one current across the world among indigenous groups, which is about this awareness to become writers of their own history. And I think you look at the powerful writing that Jacinta Calcutta is producing, it's almost irreplaceable by any Savannah at any time. So it documents experience from the most bodily level, right? The experience of being systematically disempowered. And the subaltern speak, yes. You're asking the wrong question, there's always question. So, I mean, in that sense, I see like they're also constantly navigating between the international discourse and indigenous. So you see lots of indigenous people, Archana Soran, lots of young people using these languages of indigenous people in different contexts within India, trying to form space of dialogue. So I don't know if it will move in that direction, and maybe it should not. It should have its own way of moving towards thinking about indigeneity, but definitely I'm very glad we're moving towards a direction where Adivasis are um, setting terms for conversations with non-Adivasis. I think that's very important for even writing a robust body of scholarship. We've had long debate on within subaltern studies and etc. about who can speak for whom.
Actually, my question is about the cover of your book, which you have partially answered in the so the images, the two paintings we see on the cover, which are these are different than like it is because of my ignorance, but the first time I saw this representation of Birsa Munda, which is different from the when you saw a solo figure with just bow and arrow. So can you just elaborate on these two paintings, or like and the attempt to just show the solo figure is to simplify that memory or to alter that memory, or is there any politics involved in just showing the statue as a solo figure, not the other, and ignoring the other symbolism around the that visible in that painting. So what do you think?
Yeah, so first of all, it's one painting, and the layout of the painting is in a way where I think it's fixed. And it's a painting of contrast. So, and I'm just rephrasing Lakinder that these two uh, part of painting present contrasting image of resistance. So one is instead in colonial period where the neon that represents the Jharkhand was under the rule of colonial British Raj, which is symbolized by the red um, cotton, against which Adivasi staged resistance, but the internal logic of colonialism persists. Uh, and all of this, because it's a memory project, and because I've both in there a lot, is set in the background of Pathalgadi, which is a traditional burial practice that grants some kind of memorial territory to Adivasi. But I really like that because the discussion was just about Birsa, right? Over many phone calls, and he decided not to draw him. So I had to ask him why was it that the project is on Birsa and he's not been drawn? And he said the similar thing that to you it's Birsa Munda, for us it's ordinary Munda. So it doesn't need to be about Birsa Munda, it's the general state of affairs, and I'm just using uh, deeply generalized sentences, but like it's general state of affairs that Adivasis continue to form new kinds of associations in the past, but the struggle is similar. And I thought, and you know, these are small, very small, but like these are choices that one makes in writing a book. And it may appear, um, and it has a different kind of stake. I just wanted to make the book um, have a different kind of acceptance among this because my primary reader was someone else. Of course, academia, but also people with whom I worked for some time. So yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, thanks, Rahul. This is with regard to the role that the backwardness of Adivasis play in the larger modernist process. So, if I have understood you correctly, so isn't it the case that modernist project most of the times get legitimized through the external references, like for instance, if we are backward vis-a-vis Europeans. But in your case, it appears that the Indian modernist project is contingent upon a constant reference to the backwardness of the Adivasis groups. So isn't it a overstretching of the argument and making an argument, making a variable which only plays an incidental role as a dominant? This is the question.
Yeah, great question. I mean, that's a if, when you will read, I provide more explanation, but the idea is to just illustrate how the construction of Adivasi as the backward is a language or is a condition, precondition for Indian modernity because it legitimizes a certain kind of intervention in these areas, often in the name of development policy. So when you go on to Khuti to implement or enforce rules that are not respectful of, let's say, Pesa, you use that construction. So, for instance, when Pathalgadi began to happen, one of the first commentaries was the backward way of stating your claims of rights in the states, right? So, I use that argument only to illustrate the process that you would not feel modern. And if you go to Ranchi, and I've partly grown up there, the middle class sensibility, even with the site, and I begin with an example of how Adivasi men who work as rajas in the state, when after a huge day of working as casual labor underpaid, quell their melancholy by having Harya is a site of extreme unpleasant for middle class families. So one of the concerted efforts is to not have Harya sellers across the streets in Ranchi. So that image of Adivasi as someone who drinks Harya is very much present in order for middle class to feel developed. Use development as a way to have them removed from the behavior. So I only stretch the argument to explain something, and you're right, it's incidental. It's not that modernity, it's the colonial world. And yeah, I agree. But I would love to hear when I'm more on that.
Thank you for your I want to add something with this question. Actually, I'm from Jharkhand only, and I have also lived in like Ranchi for approximately 6-7 years. And my question is that I skipped I missed the first part of this your discussion. What I have understood from my own residence in Jharkhand, because I born there and I lived there. So after the colonial struggle, Bihar from coming out of Bihar as a separate state, demand of the people of Jharkhand as a own separate state was something like that. People were expecting a lot of things will change when the control of power and state or own state will come in their hands. But what I understood that with communicating with a lot of people from I'm specifically from Chakradarpur Manoharpur area, you might be knowing about. So the people still are living in the same way they are living earlier when Jharkhand was part of Bihar. So what is your understanding or what do you want to like? I don't understand this from academic perspective as I only know the ground scenario. So how do you comment on the colonialization by the Adivasi itself? Like the government right now, the government of Adivasi like is controlling the state, but still the Adivasis are uh, not come out of these kind of things which were there in Bihar government or in colonial government.
Yeah, if I've understood you correctly, that you're saying how why the state of condition of Adivasi is not changed, even when we have Adivasi chiefs in the state. I think it's a matter of um, who is articulating this question. Do Adivasis feel the same way that they have not had similar level of stake in the state making process or state, even the procedural? So at the level of, let's say, the fact that, and you might dispute me that it's true that on the level of poverty index, on the level of migration, it remains fairly bad. But in terms of participation in politics, under the representation of current government, Adivasis definitely find themselves being represented far more than in the former government. And in fact, the hostile and the level of intimidation that existed in prior government, from cases of Pathalgadi to 30,000 people in 14, to not being able to articulate the grievance for implementation of Khatiyar in the 1932, has only found place because you have, even at the level of symbolic, Adivasi chief minister. And I know that the question is complex because by virtue of being an Adivasi chief minister does not mean that you will not find yourself some kind of benefits from ongoing transaction between different companies in these mining areas. But I feel like this is a question that must be answered by an Adivasi. But at the level of state, I could say that in terms of representation, at least under the current government, the Adivasi find themselves relatively more represented in terms of what they can do with the decision making, in the way their problems are being highlighted and underscored in the popular media, despite several contestations within the region. Yeah.
Yeah. This is about, I, I don't know whether it is related to the larger discussion we are in, but I just wanted to know that during your fieldwork, what was the perception of uh, many activists and people whom you were talking to about Arjun Munda particularly, because he was the chief minister of the state for a long time and from the BJP party, and it was during his time that most number of MOUs were signed in the state. It seemed as if the industries have been given a green card. You just come mine here and take out whatever is needed. So and for a very long time, Jharkhand has remained a BJP dominated state. So I just want to know about that dynamics. I mean, uh, how is he perceived, or what is the larger how is the larger Hindutva discourse perceived? I mean, is the narrative of this the Adivasi versus the state so if that is so stark, then how does Hindutva as a discourse find space therein? That is one.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to really look at this, and I think one instance, for instance, explain this is if you look at Alpa Shah's work on the way in which, and this was also happening in Kuti, that you have the expansion of massive Shiv Charcha in areas where Adivasis are concentrated, especially deforested areas in Kuti. But within Adivasi, there are different kind of affiliation. In my interviews with activists, they had, unlike other states, for instance, Orissa, where you have consolidated civil society. That's so Jharkhand, one of the biggest problems is the lack of civil society. So unlike Orissa, where you literally have in Bhubaneswar accounts of FRA, and within that individual and collective aims to FRA, in Jharkhand it's very dispersed and civil society is not consolidated. So to be asking online, then most of the civil society over the months and years tend to bend towards apolitical. For instance, Sanjay Basu Malik, who's the long-standing figure in the Jharkhand movement, worked alongside Ramdayal Munda, seems to lean towards Rajput party member Sudesh Mehta, who's then interested in recovering a certain kind of OBC-led Adivasi image, right? So, so it's I think any statement would be very responsible to club Adivasis together I think there are fragmented groups that mobilize around the line of interest. But I've seen a pattern, at least when I was doing the work in field. I was also trying to evaluate trends within the states during the election, especially on social media. So one of the key observations was that Arjun Munda is perhaps the most trolled minister from within the Adivasi community by free and independent um, young youth Adivasi activists. And it tells you something bigger about his policy, and it becomes more consolidated. So if you look at now his opposition or silence on Khatian being reinforced, it gives you an insight to how Adivasi he's sort of lost a mandate from within the community. So therefore he would often emerge at least in the trend in responses within the youth as someone who is not trustworthy. But he's so well woven into the network that's now widespread within Jharkhand that extend this Hindutva ideology to as and Shiv Church as a microcosm of what we have at the state level. But it transpired these ideas at the most ground level. So I think it would be interesting to see how he ties himself with the national elections next year. The issue of Khatian is going to become more relevant as we move towards the election.
There was one question there. There was one
One
question
second.
there, and then
Yeah, but
the
club,
moment.
you first. Club questions. Club questions.
Generally speaking, politics of memory and politics of constitution, which generally include distinct ways in sense that constitution wants you to appeal to make claim on the state in a particular way where your institution was driven by the past concerns and your legacy memory. So the question is, how do you think the aspect of memory is coming up in this politics of yeah, I mean, I use Pathalgadi as a way to demonstrate how memory is used as a template to stake claim. So the point in the chapter is not whether or not Pathalgadi movement was constitutional. I was interested more in why Adivasi chose burial stone as a method to assert right. They could have chosen something else, but because there are accounts from late 19th century in C.S. Macpherson with a huge extensive survey where he's noted that Adivasis were even then using burial stone as a marker of territorial belonging. So I see that continuum, it remains in the continuum that even in 2017, you have similar kind of assertion. So that really prompted me to think about the texture of memory, using burial stone as a template that extends that historical, grievance in the region. So not so much about movement in itself. And if you read the chapter, you'll find that there were varying narratives even within Adivasi community, with having faith on one end to deep suspect on the other. So not as if every Adivasi was equally mobilized on singular line when Pathalgadi was unfolding. But I was more interested in why certain kind of materials were used in order to extend the political argument. Like why is it that burial stone and not something else? That really prompted me to, and this chapter is very incidental to project because the project is on Birsa. So I should have stuck to him, but it's an extension of larger project that I envisioned, which is on material memory, how objects come to occupy place of political ideology in our life. And one of the objects was, of course,
we'll take two more questions, one from here and the other is Priyanka, because we have paucity of time.
Thank you for your talk. And it's a question both to ma'am and sir. When we talk of assimilation of Adivasi and the culture, I am from Jamshedpur. I have been born and brought up and I've lived my entire life there itself. There is very much non-existence of culture in the state itself, like in the education system, be it their language or their culture. There's absolutely no representation
there are so many different languages there. Even scripts are different, but we see the other kind of languages being propagated in state, be it, Marathi or Gujarati or languages like that. But the same is not happening in Jharkhand. So where do you see this assimilation when we say that we have to bring them in the mainstream? It's rather we are pulling them out of their culture and bringing them into the mainstream that we consider the mainstream rather than their culture being assimilated into the whole. So where do you put them in that?
I would just say that there is a popular phrase that Ramdayal Munda used to use. It's called Nachi Se Bachi. So those who will dance will survive. Now a documentary made by his son in collaboration with Abra. And he had a very strong emphasis on, he was actually the one who started what was called Adivasi Resormento as a phase in which he said the culture of Adivasi will form the basis for our identity. But it's unfortunate that over the months and years in Jharkhand now, far from having representation, we're in fact moving towards a great degree of homogenizing Adivasi through institutions. So in that sense, I don't have an answer, but there's a lot of reflection on this question, especially in 80s, huge discussion that Ramdayal takes when he returns from Chicago after his PhD and really focuses on how we should use culture as a form of politics, and one of which was, of course, there's so much shame associated to, or at least within the popular, using Adivasi worldview and languages as part of political discourse. I think if you look at some of his work, you might find some of the answer to the question. But in contemporary Jharkhand, I may not be able to.
See, the thing, if you look at, say, for example, Dr. Jangal paper, collection of writings, it's a similar thing. Talks about Kuruk identity. Talks about identity in the sense of language, culture, belonging, all of these come together. Where they are talking about the fact that even the acceptance in as something which links language, identity, and culture, even that linkage is difficult to establish, or fighting for its inclusion as language. But while this is on, one of the problems also is that we don't have textbooks. So it is possible to push this kind of marginalization. The state is pushing this kind of logic. And that is why it is so important. And right now you have a lot of, a lot of literature which is coming out, which I hope will change the scenario. But that's something else which is a problem. So it is, you're absolutely right. It's not, it's actually inclusion means exclusion. You're right in the way you frame it. I'm in agreement. I'm just saying that this is something that one is talking about. So he's talking about Ramdayal Munda. I'm looking at Nirmal Vince's papers, where this whole discussion is also of script, So this is something that one is talking about, but one also understands why this is possible. That's why they have to listen to what is coming on. This is something else which is.
And in fact, Ramdayal Munda was the first person who formed the Department for Endangered Languages at Ranchi University, which is structurally unfunded and have no hiring whatsoever. So it's quite, yeah, I mean, that's also, and it raises like larger question that Professor Dasgupta was asking, that unlike Dalit historiography, where you have documented evidence in forms of writing by Dalits themselves from as early as 19th century, we don't have that much written literature when we look at Adivasi historiography, for instance. And one wonders what happens when these languages are already disappearing. How does the language get transmitted in forms of like written records?
But this is a huge debate amongst Adivasi. It has been, not is, but it has been a huge debate amongst Adivasi intellectuals. There have been endeavors where Ramdayal Munda comes together with documents, It's all there. It's just that we haven't also looked at these bits. It's the other bit that we are responsible for not looking at.
So last one question. James.
Ma'am talked about Birsa Munda beyond Jharkhand. I'm from Odisha. In Odisha, recently the largest hockey stadium is named after Birsa Munda. And that being said, hockey is one of the sports that accommodates most of the tribal players. Not only, but one of the few sports that stands that has been able to enable tribal players to come into the national team. So there was and it is built in Raulkela, which is a region that accommodates a lot of tribal ethnic. So, so do you think naming this stadium as a from statue to stadium topic here? And do you see it is a this youth-driven, development-driven commemoration of memory is done by the stadium? Is it the right way in contrast with something that other states or parties might do, which is it is not saying Bhagwan Birsa Munda Stadium, but just Birsa Munda Stadium. How do you see this kind of state ending?
But I would say why not let us think on that?
Yeah, yeah.
This was something which came up in a huge controversy, right? When our Prime Minister referred to Beyonce in the North, referred to Mumbai. So that was something which led to a lot of discussion. So whether Birsa Munda or Bhagwan Birsa Munda, this is when you think, of these larger issues, the politics that is left to that. So here, of course, it was the reference that I was making, when I began, was Bhagwan Birsa Munda. Here it's not. You have to start actually thinking that within the name of it, what kind of politics is in it.
And also, Raukela was one of the first places, at least the records have traced, was the first place where the statue was built. So there were statues that were built before within the community spaces, but the formal installation of that statue happened actually in Raukela. But I also think that we should also think of why a statue is built in a place and what it might mean to the people around. So often you see Birsa is also, at least in the imaginary of the state institution, is an empty signifier. So you arrive at Ranchi Airport, which is called the Birsa Munda Airport. You off the plane, you go to the entrance. You have welcome to Birsa Munda Airport, and then Gandhi's history, right? And without any, it doesn't even trouble people. Like, why does it say welcome to Birsa Munda? Anyway, I don't think it's well known in the way he should be, but says the history of Gandhi in the making of nations. So I feel like these are very situated forms of politics. So it often is oriented towards a political goal. So, for instance, Sudesh Mehto making a statue of Birsa Munda was similar. It was simply just a response to Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, because in his interview he's constantly referring to the ambition is not towards actually displaying the material inequality that structure everyday life of an Adivasi, but to use memory as a form of competing claims at the level of empty signifier. So I'll use Birsa to show that I can make bigger statue, but why I'm making it is not so much a concern, and what relevance it might hold to the popular statue. So these are also statue politics is a very situated form of why did that Ambedkar cause so much of trouble and face so much of depression than Birsa. So there is a there's a political importance of each statue that's built, and I think.
Yeah, but when you're talking about the airport, there's something else that's there, and that is the singular absence of men. So you have him appearing only on the television screen. Because I just went 3-4 months earlier, and I was thinking that how come? So what is actually being projected here? It's Gandhi. So there is a larger logic. So rather than just seeing it as Gandhi versus Birsa Munda, let's expand it further and see why certain figures are being excluded and why certain figures are being included. Yes, Gandhi, but also along with Gandhi, you do have this one in the essay. So you have both. There is the full story of Gandhi which is there, but you also have Birsa Munda, but you don't have Munda. So whether this has taken place after Soren has taken over or not is another matter. Because after the COVID, it's been quite some time. I wasn't going to Ranchi, and this time when I went, just looking around and thinking, what's happening? This is different. So you have to relate it to something which moves beyond just memorizing Birsa Munda. That is the other point that I want to make. Anyway. But unfortunately, our training is such that when we go somewhere, we begin to look for linkages.
So yeah, on behalf of JNU Academic, we thank Dr. Rahul Ranjan and Dr. Sangeeta Dasgupta for a delightful discussion on the life of Birsa Munda. The good discussion and the questions that followed help all of us understanding the pertaining issues. Thank you all for joining us today. We will see you in our next session. Please go ahead and have chai at the notice board area and continue your Bombardi questions to the students. Thank you all.
Thank you, all of you. It's a wonderful experience interacting with all of you. Are you people from CPS or from other departments also?
Mostly
CHS, anybody?
Nitish.
Oh, good. Okay.